Today, we welcome to the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series Paul Schafer. Paul Schafer served as Assistant Director of the Ontario Arts Council 1967-1970, founded and directed the graduate program in Arts Administration at York University 1970-1974, and coordinated arts and international development programs at the University of Toronto 1984-1990. He has also worked with UNESCO and conducted major cultural projects for Canada's Department of External Affairs, now Global Affairs Canada. In 1989, Paul founded the World Culture Project in Markham, Canada, which he continues to direct. He has authored numerous books, including Cultural Beacon of Future, Revolution or Renaissance, The World as Culture, and The Great Cultural Awakening. His work advocates for transitioning from an economic age to a cultural age where the arts, humanities, and heritage play a central role in global development. Paul, thank you for joining the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you so much, Emiliano. The pleasure and privilege is indeed mine. I've been looking forward to this interview, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present it. I've been working in the culture. I was originally trained as an economist, but I've been working in the cultural field for almost 60 years now, and basically focusing in the earlier years on some of the most important parts of culture, such as the arts, heritage, humanities, and so on. But over the last 30 years, I've sort of been spending most of my time researching in depth culture and cultures and what we mean by that. And I came to the conclusion as a result of all my research in the cultural field that I believe we should move out of an economic age that we're in at present and into a cultural age in the future. And that's been my basic belief in all my research and writings. And the most important book, I guess, that I've written on that subject in great detail is the book Revolution or Renaissance, Making the
Revolution of
Transition
Renaissance.
from an Economic Age to a Cultural Age. So I'd like to talk about that first, and particularly I'd like to talk about the economic age. I think I call it the economic age because I think any age where we place our highest priority on a particular activity is probably wise to label it as a age of, could be a religious age or a technological age or in this case an economic age, because we've put the highest priority on economics and economies, and that can be traced back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. As you know, he wrote and published that book in 1776, just at the time when the Industrial Revolution was in full swing in England. And I've made the case in the book that putting the emphasis on economics and economies, and particularly developing the cultural age, is the greatest human achievement in history to date. And by far, no other activity, landing people on the moon, creating science, developing technologies, could in any way match it. It's a phenomenal development, and I think we should recognize that. I'd like just to say a word about some of the basic features of the economic age for clarification. Adam Smith said that above all, what we should do if we want to create goods, services, and material and monetary wealth, what we should do is we should break wholes up into parts, and we should specialize on the production of the parts. His argument was that we could create many more goods and services if people specialized in a very specific production than if they generalized on all activities in the production process. And he confirmed his case by using the example of a pin factory, and countless more of pins could be created by people specializing on particular functions than generalized on all functions. So this is specialization and productive, what he called productive and unproductive labor. Productive labor was labor that produced material products. Unproductive labor that was labor that didn't produce material products. And I should mention here that that was the beginning of marginalizing the arts and culture in societies and
Mm.
countries, which I'll come back to. Anyway, he felt that if each person specialized in a particular production function and everybody pursued their own self-interests, then the most goods and services and material and monetary wealth would be created. And indeed, we could see as a result of that that this has been the case. And he further went on to say that there was an invisible hand, if everybody was doing this, steering the economic development so that everything would turn out for the best. And it's always been a problem for scholars to know whether he was thinking about God being the invisible hand or the marketplace. In retrospect, it was probably the marketplace. So I want to go on and talk about one other economist and group of economists that played what I think is the most substantial role in this process, and that's Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall was what they call a neoclassical economist who wrote the Principles of Economics, and his involvement in it was to look at how economic systems functioned and developed. And he studied the laws of supply and demand and how the interaction of supply and demand determines prices. He put a great deal of emphasis on the marketplace as the vehicle for solving all the problems that existed as goods and services were created. But the particular significance of this is that the neoclassical economists created an ideal economic system. And that system for them worked best when consumers were maximizing their consumer satisfaction in the marketplace and producers were producing as many goods and services as possible and maximizing their profits.
Yeah.
Now, this is very essential to the problems we now have in the world, as we know, and going forward into the future. So this was a very specific take on how people should behave in economic systems and how corporations should behave. That was seen generally as the way in which we should go developing economics and economies. This has had an enormous impact on the world over the last 2 centuries. I say it's the greatest achievement because billions of people throughout the world, first in the Western world, but increasingly in other parts of the world, have had their standards of living and quality of life improved enormously through making a commitment to developing economics and economies. But there's a problem here. And the problem is when all this was taking place over the last 250 years from 1776, no consideration was given to the natural environment. No consideration was really given to the human environment in terms of people as human beings rather than consumers. And no consideration was given to the cultural environment.
Mm.
And what we've seen over the last 250 years is the progressive development of some very dangerous and life-threatening problems. And those problems, essentially, as we know, are climate change, global warming, and the environmental crisis as the most serious problem in the world today, increasing inequalities and disparities in income and wealth, which is getting more and more difficult and awkward to deal with because income distribution has become more and more unequal in the world. Wars and conflicts that are now breaking out with the underlying problem of taking territories or land and claiming territories and land and resources, incidentally, for themselves rather than others, and also just generally what difficulties are evolving from the interaction of people with different cultures and ways of life and worldviews and value systems, which has become an extremely difficult problem today, both within countries and in the world as a whole, outside countries. So that
Absolutely.
sort of sets the stage for us in talking about why it's so important to enter into a cultural age in the future.
Absolutely. That's a great background that you are sharing here. And I want to ask you a specific question. What are the defining characteristics of a cultural age? You're also talking about a transition from an economic age to a cultural age. I found this concept very, very interesting. I've been writing about transitioning from neoliberalism to a values-based pedagogy in my publications. I found that the two concepts are similar and they certainly have point of contacts. But the question is, uh, what are the characteristics, in your opinion, of a cultural age? And do you see global citizenship education playing a role in this shift?
Well, I'll answer that question, but I think I'll answer it in the process of moving forward with some of my other publications that are now more specifically focused on what a cultural age might be and what are the sort of foundations and parameters and so on for a cultural age. The biggest problem facing people in the cultural field today at all levels, we're not only talking about people that are working in various areas of culture, but international organizations like the UN and UNESCO and the World Bank and on it goes, as you
Hmm.
know, is what do we mean by the term culture?
Hmm.
And this caused me several years ago to write a second book on this subject, which is The World as Culture.
The
And the
word,
subtitle of that book is uh, uh, from a cultivation of the soul to the cosmic whole. It started with, as far as cultural definitions and meanings are concerned, it started a long time ago when Marcus Cicero defined culture formally, a great orator and cultural scholar, as you know better than many
Mhm.
others. He said, culture is the philosophy or cultivation of the soul. And it derived essentially, I think, from the Latin verb colo or colere, which means
Mhm.
cultivation or looking after the growth and development of plants and other activities.
Yeah.
But this was his particular view. And I think while this doesn't come back immediately in the evolution of culture as an idea and reality, it's now having greater prominence today. But we can really divide in the evolution of culture and cultures, incidentally, as an idea and reality. We can really break that process from Cicero to the present into three very specific periods. The first period, which goes from the time of Cicero up to 1871, the focus really in trying to come to grips with what culture and cultures meant was basically they meant the arts. We saw
Mhm.
this right from almost the beginning of human life
Yeah.
on Earth with the cave drawings and pictorial illustrations of human beings and animals. The humanities, which were very important, as we know, during the Roman and Greek empires, the heritage of history, which a number of countries focused on in some depth in 18th and 19th centuries. And more recently, we've added the cultural industries to that kind of notion, publishing, radio, television,
Yeah.
visual, virtual realities, digital technologies, and so on. So, and now just much more recently, people in the arts and cultural field are adding sports to that
Mm.
activity because of the popularity of sports generally in the Olympic Games in particular. So when people talk about the cultural sector, in the world today. That's really the group of activities that they have in mind. And that particular view of culture has fitted very nicely into the economic age. And it's done this because all of those activities are largely concrete material and tangible, some intangible, as UNESCO has pointed out. But those activities can be watched, seen, picked up, bought and sold in the marketplace. And so they have an importance in and of themselves. They have an importance in terms of being contributors to social activities, economic growth and development, political activities, festivals, fairs, and so on. But they are also symbolic in the sense that a lot of those activities, whether it's music or it's architectural edifices like churches, cathedrals, mosques, temples, pagodas, monuments and sites, dances, on and on it goes, can be enjoyed because they have a kind of tangible significance. But those activities then can act as symbols to opening the doors to much larger understandings of culture. And that brings us to the second phase. In 1871, Edward Burnett Tyler, who is generally seen as one of the first or the first anthropologists in the world, defined culture formally as the complex whole or the
Mm.
total way of life of people and countries. This is a very holistic view of culture and cultures. When anthropologists went out into the field in the late 19th and beginning of the 20th century to study cultures in depth and on the ground, what they discovered is that people in those parts of the world had words for all the specific activities they were engaged in, but they didn't have a word for how all these activities were combined together in different combinations and arrangements to create a whole way of life or a whole way of living lives. And Tyler and other anthropologists who confirmed this said, well, this is really kind of a holistic experience because it's everything. It's taking everything together and how these different activities and processes are rearranged and organized. Their interest, and this has spawned an interest, as you know, more recently in the works of psychologists, sociologists, people in cultural
Exactly.
studies, and so on in the world. It now is very, very interesting what's going on in those areas, but all those areas were largely ignored because we were living in an economic age and thought we were on the right track, and those things were just interesting, but not really very important. So that was the second phase in the development. The third phase has occurred more recently. It's occurred largely since the end of the Second World War. And here's where it becomes very, very interesting for us because what's happened in the last 40 or 50 years is we've abandoned our idea of thinking that culture is the one thing in the world that separates us from other species.
Right,
And
right.
in the more religious experience or spiritual experience, that's what separated human beings from other species. That we had culture and they didn't. And that was terribly important in confirming for people that they were on a different plane entirely than other species. What we found, as you know, through the studies of biologists, zoologists, botanists, horticulturalists, on and on it goes, is that the similarities between the human species and other species is much greater than the differences. We're now discovering that yes, plants can have cultures, animals can have cultures. A lot of research has been done in this area in recent years. And we found, for example, that plants, especially trees, where an enormous amount of research has gone on, they can communicate with their collaborators and fellow species through their root systems. And it's a very fascinating kind of process. They talk to people, they warn people if there are particular dangers. We're finding out that. The same thing is true and more so with animals. All the work that's been done on animals suggests that animals have cultures much like human beings have cultures, whether it's the wolf culture or the elephant culture or the sheep and lamb cultures. It goes on and on. But just as a very specific example, as we go along, there's been great interest in that area of animal cultures in China over the last 30 or 40 years, where they focused on just to show how this manifests itself in the human species and human cultures. They focused on the wolf culture and the sheep culture to look at their international relations and have come to the conclusion they've historically been not such an aggressive warring society, but in more recent years, they I think have decided that perhaps their international cultural relations were too passive, and so they've had to become more aggressive, and so they've identified more with the wolf culture than the sheep culture, which is more passive and far less aggressive. So that
Interesting.
book has a separate chapter on the behavior and cultures of other species.
The
So
World as Culture, the book, The World as Culture.
the
Yes,
world
yes,
of culture. And
yes,
what
yes.
makes, I think this is a very important book for all people and not just people in the cultural
Mm,
field, because my conclusion from all of this,
mm,
Emilio, before we go into the final book, is that culture and cultures in this holistic sense as complex wholes and overall ways of life of people and countries are the real foundations of life on planet Earth for all species, most importantly, human species, but plants, animals, and all other species share this. So this is the real foundation for all species in the way in which they interact with the natural environment and go on with life and living.
mm,
It's the essence of life and living for all species. And this is a very different idea than the idea in the economic age, which was brought to the fore by Karl Marx and his economic interpretation of history, who
mm,
said that the foundational basis for everything in the world is economics and economies. And
mm.
he looked at that in terms, as we know, in terms of quantitative activities and particularly materialism. And his interpretation of history is also called the materialistic history interpretation of history or the economic interpretation of history. What I'm suggesting in this book is that that was useful in developing the economic age, but it presents a big problem for going forward into a cultural age.
Absolutely. And we get to the role of culture in the great cultural awakening. I like to touch on this and discuss this with you, potentially how it relates to the concept of global citizenship education.
Okay. This brings me to the third book. We're now down in terms of the definitions of culture in a cultural age. We're now down to culture as the complex whole or the total way of life of people and other species, and the arts, humanities, heritage of history, and cultural industries, and so on, have a very crucial role to play in that because, in symbolic terms, because they open the doors to how we can understand this much broader view of culture and cultures. So, what I've contended in this book, this is now talking about how the cultural age can be realized in fact, is that approaching this from the ground up rather than the top down. And this is terribly important because we know that one of the approaches to culture, and a very important approach in the 19th and 20th century, has been a more top-down approach. And this is the reverse of that. It's saying if we're going to develop a cultural age, it should start with us as people. And I know some scholars that are seeing now people as cultures, and people as cultures in the sense that everybody has enormous cultural experiences through their lives. They are involved in the whole process of creating their life as a whole, made up of many parts, the body, the brain, the mind, and so on. And some interesting research, as you know, is going on in that area now about the
Absolutely.
role that the arts and humanities can play in that. So we start with people, and the people that are doing this work on people as culture see our people themselves as having their own cultural stories, and they're recording their cultural stories and giving them identity and significance at the individual level. So we move from people as culture. The next step in the process, terribly important one, is children, parents, homes, and families. We have to get this right going forward in the future, as you've been emphasizing in your work, and I'm trying to emphasize in my work. This is the way in which the future generations are going to be educated. And so we have to look at this area very seriously and consider the kinds of cultures people are exposed to from very, very early in life that often shape their worldviews and value systems before they're 3 or 4 years of age, how
Right.
they interact with people that don't have those values and worldviews and lifestyles, but maybe others that are very different, how they
Yeah.
interact with people in all this whole area.
This
So we
discussion on
got to,
values is getting really, really core, considering the society we live in, the societies we live in.
yeah, absolutely. So this is a very critical element in the development of a cultural age, the training and education of future generations. So we go there immediately to communities, schools, and education as the next step up the ladder, up the cultural ladder. And now we're working our way all the way up the cultural ladder now. This is very important, as we know, because education and communities and schools are essential for the kind of education and training that we're going to get in the future. And in the chapter, there's a chapter on each of these areas as we go up the cultural ladder. In this particular chapter, I've set out a kind of a prototype for an ideal cultural education, starting in elementary school and going up to post-secondary schools and on into adult education and learning, which really focuses on how can we understand what culture means in this holistic sense, and more specifically, how our own culture functions in this sense, and how other cultures function, and how all these interactions are going on between the diverse cultures of the world. We move from there, of course, up the cultural ladder to towns, cities, and regions, a very, very nice, compact area that have become
Yeah.
increasingly important as people move out of the countryside and into towns and cities and local areas. And now what's going on, there's a lot of research going on now, as you know, in what they call cultural placemaking. How do we develop these towns, cities, and regions as cultural wholes rather than just economic resources to be capitalized on for the benefits they provide in economic terms? We then move to the national, world, universe, and cosmic areas. Very, very important, I guess, going forward into the future are these national cultures? What are they all about? How are they now interacting on the global stage? What direction should they be headed in the future? We're seeing now beyond this that we have the beginnings of extraterrestrial cultures. Much more is going up into outer space. There's all the way from drones to satellites. There's another culture that's evolving in the universe as a result of our projections beyond the Earth, and
Absolutely.
ultimately this connects with the cosmic environment. So that's what the nature of
We
this
could
book.
start perhaps talking about cosmic citizenship education or planetarian citizenship education. That's another interesting theme. All right, this is very interesting. I want to sort of try to tie all these very interesting themes we discussed today, including revolution or renaissance, the wordless culture, the great cultural awakening. You discussed in very interesting terms the content of your publications, the concept behind these publications, and what you think really about culture. I want to ask you, moving toward the end of this very interesting conversation, I want to ask you a question related to your World Culture Project in Canada. So, what is the World Culture Project, and potentially at least, how does it tie to concept of planetarian citizenship, global citizenship education in the discussions we are having today?
Thank you very much for that introduction of the World Culture Project. As you know, the United Nations has had decades for development, going back to after the Second World War. In the beginning, they were mostly economic development decades. And then there was an environmental decade. And following the environmental decade, there was a cultural decade for development, and that went on from 1988 to 1997. And I wanted, because I was so absorbed in culture by that time and the different cultures in the world, I wanted to commemorate that decade for cultural development. And so I decided to create the World Culture Project. And I divided it into two components, a kind of international general component, which would look at these concepts and ideas and issues in more general terms and their relevance globally or internationally. And then I would create a Canadian component, and I'd take what I'd learned from the general component and apply it to a specific
In
culture,
the context.
world Canadian culture. So that is how the World Culture Project is constructed, international component and a Canadian component. UNESCO in 1988 designated a world cultural development activity, and the focus of the project was and still is on fleshing out the holistic understanding of culture and cultures that we were talking about earlier by looking at that in general terms and specific terms in the case of Canada. And I've written a number of books on Canadian culture and creativity with that emphasis in mind. And the books that we've been talking about in the more general area, the World Culture Project wasn't very active from 1988 to, I would say roughly 2020, and wasn't getting many visits. But in the last 3 or 4 years, the visits have escalated astronomically. I'm now getting more than 4,000 visits a month to the site. And the site is packed with information about articles, podcasts, videos, books, articles on various aspects of culture going forward into the future. Having said that, I'll come to the question that you asked at the beginning, and that is, how does this all fit in? with the wonderful work you and your colleagues have been doing on global citizenship education.
Thank you. Thank you.
And,
Appreciate, Paul.
you asked me to take 3 words to
Exactly.
describe
Exactly. Three key words.
what comes to mind for me quickly and almost instantaneously that relates to your work. And I've given that a great deal of thought. I've watched some of your earlier interviews and have seen that you ask this question at the end of some of your interviews. And the 3 words that I would pick, and I'd like to elaborate on a bit, would be holism.
Holism.
Holism as the first word. Second word I have is harmony.
Harmony. Okay,
Harmony.
good.
And the third word is curiosity.
Curiosity.
So
Okay, quite new keywords. Interesting.
let me first talk about why I put holism at the top of the 3 words.
Hmm.
I think the basic challenge facing humanity today and going forward into the future is to progressively evolve the idea of holism, because the idea of specialization, breaking
Hmm.
wholes apart, drove the economic age, as we know. And I think in the
Hmm.
same way, the commitment to holism and understanding what holism is all about should drive the cultural age. We should be thinking now very seriously about how do we take all these different parts that exist, as
Hmm.
people have done in developing cultures in their countries, as the anthropologist pointed out. How do we bring all these parts together to create, to put the whole back together again? I guess this is what we might say about that.
Yeah,
And
in the sense that we need
I,
an holistic approach. That's very interesting. Yes,
and
yes.
I think that approach really arises through broadening and deepening our understanding of culture and cultures as ideas and realities. I came across much earlier in my life when I did a very intensive study of culture and cultures over the better part of 30 years. I came into contact with the work of many cultural scholars, and I learned an enormous amount about all this from the works of cultural scholars, which I found not only had relevance at their own time and in their own societies and periods in history, but also going forward into the future. And on this particular question of the importance of holism and the holistic perspective seen by culture, I came across a quotation by Goethe, and he said, "Live in the whole, live in the good, and live in the beautiful."
Interesting.
And that has driven my life from the moment I saw it. It just resonated with me 100%. And I think it must resonate strongly with you and a lot of other people too. Uh, this is what we're doing. We're trying to live in the whole, both within ourselves and finding the whole within ourselves, but also living in the whole in the
Not
sense
easy.
out in the community, whether it's a town, city, or the world. It's trying to find the whole and how all these things come together.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Live in the whole, live in the good. This relates very much not only to your idea of global citizenship education, but especially, and I think so important going
Mm,
forward into the future, ethical global citizenship education.
exactly.
Live
Which
in
we
the good.
discussed at the launch of the book. Yeah, absolutely.
Very important thing driving our lives should be getting out of the me generation and the focus on the ego and the self, and getting into the area of the other and
Mm,
how we develop the spirituality and compassion and kindness to deal with other people. Live in the good. Make the most of your time on earth by helping other people with their problems and difficulties, and live in the beautiful. We go back to the arts, but we don't go back to the arts as vehicles for economic growth. we go back to the arts for the enormous importance
Mm.
they play in creating beauty in the world. I mean, we've talked going back to Plato about music being the universal language. If we can develop that more effectively and how that applies to our future development, I think this would be a great achievement going forward. So
So that's why
living.
you mentioned harmony as a second key word, because it's a balance of these elements that you are discussing, I guess, I assume.
Absolutely. And when you were talking earlier about what are the foundations and the principles on which
The
the
great
Great
cultural
Cultural
awakening.
Awakening is based, there's a specific chapter in that book on the need to harmonize crucial cultural relationships. And the example that I've used in order to emphasize the critical importance of harmonization is the enormous disharmony and imbalance that's opened up between the arts and humanities and heritage of history on the one hand, and science on the other hand. And these have become enormously polarized in the modern world. We've given enormous chunks of money to developing the sciences, and I'm not debating the importance of that and how where we go with that area. But in the process of doing that, as we know, we cut back on the arts and humanities and heritage of history, and most noticeably in educational institutions. This could be traced back to C.P. Snow and his book, The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution, which played a role in marginalizing the arts, culture, and humanities further, while at the same time giving a tremendous boost to the development of the sciences because they got incorporated in the economic age. So we have to find going forward into the future because the arts and sciences underlie so many activity. We need to find that harmony between the arts and the sciences. That's the example that I've given to illustrate the importance of harmony. Another very important area in that particular domain is the whole question of how we deal with people's rights and people's responsibilities.
Rights and
And it's,
responsibilities.
and
Absolutely.
it's understandable over the last 80 or 90 years and coming out of the Second World War that all the focus of attention was on people's rights and cultural rights, social rights, economic rights. And that's gone on for the last 60 or 70 years, that almost 95% of the attention has been focused on rights and how rights have been established at different levels, international, national, provincial, local, how rights are being respected and enforced. So we've put an enormous amount of energy on that. But in the process of doing that, much like the disharmony between the sciences and the arts, we've ignored people's responsibilities. And
Exactly.
there's a very, this is documented in detail in this chapter. There's a very important group of people that have been looking at the need to look much more closely and carefully at people's responsibilities. I mean,
Yeah.
what responsibilities do we have given the luxuries and help we've had, and most importantly, giving back as part of our responsibilities? So that
Absolutely. And contributing to the common good, as I like to
contributing to the common good. And
emphasize.
ultimately, I think where we should be headed in that, and I think your work is particularly important in all this, is developing a universal declaration of cultural rights and responsibilities. So that's
Absolutely.
another area. A
Let's
third area,
work on that together.
I won't, okay, well, let's do that. A third area I would mention, there are many areas. We could talk about the self or the other. All these things are becoming polarized today, as we know, and creating great tensions and apprehension and
Yeah.
anxiety. The third area that I'd mention, though, because it relates so much to the economic age and the cultural age, is the disharmony between wealth and well-being. I think wealth is an ideal word for the economic age. Well-being is an ideal word for the cultural age. Well-being is very different than wealth, as we know. Wealth is a small notion. It's concerned with creating material and monetary wealth. It has great importance in the world. I'd never debate that, but I would debate the fact that we maybe have become too preoccupied with it. Well-being, I think, finds that balance between the quantitative and qualitative or material and
Yeah,
non-material dimensions of life. We don't need enormous sums of money to live a happy life. We can have a
absolutely.
happy life just by concerning ourselves with our own well-being.
Yeah,
So
surrounding ourselves with a bit more of nature too, it would be beneficial, I believe. And
absolutely.
you mentioned curiosity. I like to discuss that last point too, because that's a very interesting element that you mentioned.
Which one?
Curiosity. So you mentioned
Oh yeah,
holism, you
yeah,
mentioned
curiosity.
harmony, and then we have a third keyword that you mentioned, if I understood correctly, that is curiosity. Did I understand correctly?
Mhm. Well, I'll start that. You see, here is where I've learned so much about my own personal development and development generally from the works of cultural scholars. I would consider, I know Maria Montessori is internationally famous for her educational uh, pedagogies and
Mhm.
ideas, but I consider her to be as much a cultural contributor as an educational contributor. And I came across a statement by her a long time ago where she said, culture and education have no bounds or limits.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
I
a
thought this is perfect for our discussion today and for what we're talking about going forward. If we can develop for the unlimited potential of education and culture, if we can become really curious about that, how are people being educated in different parts of the world now? What are the basic motives behind the present educational curriculum? How might we go forward into the future and learning more about the different cultures in the world and coming to a better understanding of other people's points of view and cultures? And there's no limits there. We could just go on and delve deeper and deeper.
absolutely.
And I thought this was such a wonderful comment by her that is so valuable. So I would see curiosity. We've had it from the beginning of time. It explains so much about everything that's happened in the world and for human beings. It's our curiosity, our creativity, our ingenuity, our
That makes the
imagination that's
difference.
driven us, and let's have it drive us more in the future through ethical global citizenship and entering a cultural age and enabling it to flourish.
So thank you, Paul Schafer, for joining this interview series on global citizenship education. Very interesting themes, including the Great Cultural Awakening, the World of Culture, Revolution and Renaissance, and of course, your very interesting World Cultural Project, which you are leading in Canada. It was a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Emiliano. It's my privilege and pleasure.